The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, February 18th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape. Steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, folks, a powerhouse. We are on vacation, but we have 2 interviews for you. Well, 1.5. First up will be part 1 of an interview I did with Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts-Lowell, Bill Lazonick, on one of my bailiwicks, stock buybacks. We're going to be playing part 1 today. That'll be about 9 minutes long. Then in part 2, an interview with Professor of English and American Studies at Baruch College, City University of New York, Michael E. Staub, on the Mismeasure of Minds, debating race and intelligence between Brown and the bell curve. This is also wheelhouse stuff around here. Both of them fascinating interviews, different fields, but really interesting stuff. We are on vacation. Today is today officially President's Day? I'm getting some nods, some sort of from the crack research team.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. A definitive response. Today is President's Day. Michael's just sitting on the couch. I don't think so. No, I said it all the time. President's Day. So, remember, I guess we probably always just created myths around our presidents, but this one, woof, not good. It's the saddest thing in the world when your kid sees the president as unequivocally evil and doesn't even know the real bad stuff that they do. Right? I mean, like, when you're considered bad from like a 5.5-year-old's perspective, you're just bad. You're like cartoonishly bad. There's a lot of that going around. All right, folks, we've got a great week of programming for you. Some fascinating interviews on the criminal justice system, on the concept of fraud, and gets into a little bit of like a libertarians type of stuff. We have issues on the implications of war, and then at the end of the week, we have, I think, what I consider to be one of the more fascinating. I mean, as soon as I was done with it, I just said to Brendan, we pre-taped it, and Brendan came in. I was like, just put that on the list for the best of. And frankly, today's as well. But at the end of the week, we talked to Matthew Blackwell on the intractability, I mean, of racism on some level, and in certain areas of the country. And we will, the actual interview itself is just fascinating. My mind was just like constantly being blown
There's a spoiler. Turns out the effects of slavery aren't entirely behind us.
Well, way to ruin the interview, Matt.
I don't think that ruins
I know,
the
I'm joking. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Just a reminder, this program relies on your support. Obviously, when we're on break, we get less of a response in terms of membership. But if you have the opportunity, join the majorityReport.com. Literally nickels and dimes a day, and you can keep this content coming. First up, Professor of Economics, University of Massachusetts-Lowell. It will be Professor William Lazonick. And for members, stick around. We have a Brendan's pick from the deep archive, the super deep archives, the old Majority Report on Air America. We've let Brendan run through the vault without any supervision, which is dangerous because there's old, big reel-to-reel stuff in there.
It's like Indiana Jones.
Yeah, and so he came out holding stuff, and there you go. All right, so first up, Professor Bill Lazonick. So, Professor, you and I have discussed the question of stock buybacks. I think at first we talked about it was several years ago, and this comes out of research you did about what the implications of stock buybacks have meant to corporate America. But before we get to that, just give us a little. I don't think that most people, frankly, know that 30 years ago, and I guess maybe it was closer to 40 years ago, stock buybacks it was criminal to do that.
Well, it could be criminal, yeah. So I'll just give you some background on that, and the readers let them know where this thing came from. So basically, first of all, I think what everybody has to understand is that any company, if it's going to produce competitive products, get high productivity, pay its workers well, it has to make profits and reinvest those profits. That's the foundation of corporate finance. And if it starts paying out too much money out of a company, you're going to pay for it in terms of the competitive position, and the workers are going to pay for it. And actually, taxpayers are going to pay for it, too, if the companies say in order to compete, they need lower taxes, which they always do, because we support those companies through government investment in infrastructure and knowledge and all kinds of subsidies. Okay, so when companies make profits, you want them to be able to keep their workers employed, to pay them the productivity those workers help generate, and to reinvest in both keeping those products competitive and the next round of competitive products, because what generates profits today doesn't necessarily generate profits in the future. And in a corporation that's publicly listed, traditionally what happens is that when companies have done that and have some money left over, they pay dividends to people who hold shares. And the people who hold shares are really not active in the company generally. They're people who just buy and sell shares on the market. They're households really just trying to save their money, and the dividends give them an income. And that's the way things were coming into the 1980s. At that time, the debate in business schools and in boardrooms was often, are companies paying too much dividends given that you need to reinvest in the company? But at that point, you had a change, and it really was totally the result of Ronald Reagan getting elected on a deregulation platform. You had a change in the view of how corporations should be governed, which later, it didn't really happen right at that point coming in the 80s, but by the mid-80s it was kind of virulent, and that is the company should be run for shareholders, or maximizing shareholder value. So that's something that really became the creed of corporate governance, and still is in the 80s and beyond.
And just to be clear, this notion of shareholder value in judging the success, I guess, of a company, what was the measure of success prior to that? Like conceptually, what was that?
Well, I think the measure of success was generally not your stock price. I mean, people might have looked at the stock price, but people looked at, did the company keep people employed? It's a good place to work. Did they pay higher wages? Did they help drive up wages in the economy? Did, under affirmative action, for example, in the late 80s and 90s, were more minorities and women employed in those companies? There was a notion of a company not necessarily as a social philanthropy, but at least as an entity that was central to the economy, where people went and worked hard, and the gains were shared in a way that we could have a prosperous middle class. And that started to disappear in the 1980s. And shareholder value was really the ideology that helped make it disappear, and helped to say, no, we don't need to worry about the people we employ. We don't need to worry about the government, the fact the government is funding infrastructure and knowledge and giving us subsidies. Let's just give what they call returns and to shareholders. Now, these words are ideologically loaded, because when you say return something to someone, is that they gave you something. Well, actually, shareholders don't generally give companies money. They buy outstanding shares. And when a company goes public, for example, the venture capitalists call it an exit strategy. They now can sell their shares and cash in. And but this is the ideology that came basically out of economics, not necessarily challenged by liberal economists, but particularly out of Chicago economics at first, and then became dominant, that the only people who took risk in a company were the shareholders, and therefore they should get all the cash that was available in the company, and they had a right to it. And so what happened was that in 1982, the Securities and Exchange Commission, under a Wall Street banker named John Shad, who thought that the more money you had going out into the financial markets, the more capital formation you had. He was actually a big fan of derivatives coming from Wall Street. We know where that led us. And he basically pushed through a rule that was very obscure, frankly, until I started writing about it several years ago, and it's called Rule 10b-18, which basically says that companies can do massive amounts of stock repurchases and not have any fear of being charged with manipulating the market. And that's where the issue of legality, illegality comes in. Buybacks were never really illegal, but it always was possible before November of 1982, in the adoption of Rule 10b-18, that if you did too much in the way of buybacks, the SEC might say, hey, you're manipulating your stock price. And what I'm talking about here is open market repurchases, just telling your broker to go buy stock on the market. And that's actually what it is. It is a manipulation of the market. The rule that came in not only said that you can do large-scale stock repurchases, the actual amount that you're allowed to do under a safe harbor is 25% on any single day of your average daily trading volume over the previous 4 weeks. Okay, now what that means, if you take a company like Apple, within the safe harbor, that 25% of the average daily trading volume over the previous 4 weeks, they can do about 1.4 billion a day. Microsoft can do about 750 million a day. Many companies can do 250 million, 100 million, depends on their trading volume and the price of their stock.
Okay, so Bill, let me just so the long and short of it is, when these companies do these stock buybacks, it pushes up the price of the stock. They are incentivized to do this not just for the shareholders who buy the stock in the open market, but because the C-suite, the board of directors, they are all paid in stocks, essentially, either in options or in specific stocks that's been issued to them. They do that because of the capital gains tax structure that we have, that also was implemented in the 80s, at least in a more extreme way. And so there's a misaligned incentives by the leadership of the company. Now, so let me ask you this, and we got to take a break in just a moment. But before we do, So assuming that this ideology was manifested itself, this shareholder value ideology manifested itself in the idea of capital gains taxes being reduced, but also in the relaxing of circumstances where you could do stock buybacks. And there's been substantial reporting that the SEC doesn't even uphold the minor restrictions on it.
Yeah.
Why are stock buybacks necessarily any worse than, let's say, paying dividends?
Yeah. So dividends, first of all, you have to pay dividends to everybody who holds shares. And dividends give you a yield for holding stock. Now, that having been said, we know that stock holding is very highly concentrated in the United States. According to the research by Ed Wolf, about 84% of the stocks are held by about 10% of households. But at least all those households are getting a dividend, and those dividends can be too high. But what has happened since the mid-1980s, when basically the SEC legalizes what I call the looting of the business corporation in the United States, buybacks have been on top of dividends. And buybacks, the way you make money from buybacks is by getting a price boost and timing the buying and selling of shares. And in the case of executives, that is through exercising their stock options and then selling the shares, getting their stock awards and selling the shares, and that's how they make their gains. And by the way, it's actually not related to capital gains tax, because the ordinary tax came down, of course, in the 1980s, and most of these gains are taxed at the ordinary tax rate, almost all of them. So it's mainly about just their executive pay, but if you take the pay of top executives in large companies, 60 to 85% of it is stock-based. So the majority is either the gains from stock awards or stock options. And they're incentivized to get the stock price up, and stock buybacks are a great way of doing it. You can also hit earnings per share targets. Yep, go ahead.
All right, Bill, we got to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about a potential solution that's been introduced by Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer together, of all people. Okay, that was part one. We will play part two of that interview with Bill Lazonick tomorrow. First, I want to tell you about Joybird. Have you heard about them? They're a company behind the revolution in online furniture shopping. They offer one-of-a-kind furniture made to your unique taste. At Joybird, you can turn your ideas into reality with hundreds of styles and options, from mid-century modern to contemporary classics. I got to say, I am partial to the mid-century modern. That is my jam, as the kids would say. All customizable in an amazing array of fabric choices, from rich buttery leather to plush velvets to every color imaginable. In fact, I've got on my desk a swatch sample that they sent for free. I'm going through it right now, thinking about a swivel chair or maybe even a couch. There's even a wide range of kid and pet-friendly upholstery available. I wish I knew about that years ago. As well as a free personal design consultant to help you nail down the perfect design. And with Joybird's 365-day home trial, you can skip the furniture store and bring the showroom home. Sit on it, sleep on it, break it in, and if you don't love your Joybird, you can return it for a full refund. In-home delivery is hassle-free. They'll even remove all the packing materials. And returns are free within 2 weeks of delivery. See how Joybird is revolutionizing online furniture shopping. Create the furniture that brings you joy today at joybird.com/majority. Go to joybird.com/majority. Receive an exclusive offer for 25% off your first order, 25% off, using the code majority. That's joybird.com/majority, using the code majority. Also, has your company outgrown QuickBooks? Our share of spreadsheets, manual processes, and legacy systems costing you time and money? Introducing NetSuite by Oracle, the business management software that handles every aspect of your business in an easy-to-use cloud platform. With NetSuite, you can save time, money, and unheeded headaches by managing sales, HR, and finance and accounting instantly right from your desk or even your phone. Thousands of best-known and fastest-growing companies use NetSuite to manage their businesses, and now it's available to you. Better yet, it's more affordable than you think. Right now, NetSuite is offering you valuable insights to help you overcome the obstacles that are holding you back free. Don't miss out on unleashing your business's full potential with this free guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth. You'll learn how to acquire new customers, increase profits, and finally get real visibility into your cash flow. Get NetSuite's guide, Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth, at netsuite.com/majority. Now that's netsuite.com/majority to download their free Crushing the 5 Barriers to Growth guide today. Check it out. It could help your business. netsuite.com/majority. All right, and now we are going to go to our second interview of the day. Man. We just give it away, don't we? It is Professor Michael E. Staub. He's a professor of English and American Studies at Baruch College in City University of New York. His new book, The Mismeasure of Minds, Debating Race and Intelligence Between Brown and the Bell Curve. Quick break, then we'll be back with that. Don't forget, jointhemajority.report.com. You get extra content, you get it commercial free, and you support the show. Back with Michael Staub in a sec. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of English and American Studies at Baruch College in the CUNY college system, Michael E. Staub. He is the author of his latest, I should say, is The Mismeasure of Minds, Debating Race and Intelligence Between Brown and the Bell Curve. Just published by the UNC Press. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
So let's just start with the title. Your title, The Mismeasure of Minds, is, of course, an homage, I guess, of sorts, or a hat tip to I believe, the work of Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man. Why? Why?
Well, it's for lots of reasons. It is absolutely an homage to Professor Gould, whose work first came out in '81 and then was reissued after the publication of the Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray infamous book, The Bell Curve, in 1994, and then Gould's book came out in 1996 with a long epilogue that took on directly the fallacious arguments, the erroneous evidence, the pernicious sort of strategies that Herrnstein and Murray had made in their 1994 book. So really, although I humbly, I say this in all humility, I do see my book as an effort to sort of extend into the 21st century, and with the advantage of really 25 years hindsight, because, the Bell Curve came out in '94, it's now 2019, we are marking, I hesitate to say celebrating, but marking the 25th anniversary of the publication of the Bell Curve, which was a major, major cultural, political, social, policy moment in the rise of the right-wing assault on public education, educational reform more generally, on all sorts of funding efforts to equalize opportunity in educational settings. And if I may, I'd just like to briefly, for your listeners, just run down the 4 basic premises of the Bell Curve in case some of your listeners aren't old enough to remember 1994, and if they do remember it, maybe these details have sort of slid out of their brains in the last quarter century.
I will add, sadly, what is old is new again. Charles Murray, and we've spoken about that, but let's remind people of those 4 basic principles that he was pushing there.
Basically, and this again is part of my debt to Stephen Jay Gould, because he takes on and dismantles these 4 arguments piece by piece. The first is that IQ frankly, that IQ exists, that it exists as a single unitary factor, that it is a thing that we can, in fact, measure with a number, with a single number. And the second thing is that Herrnstein and Murray argue is that it cannot be changed. It's fixed. You're born with an IQ, you live with an IQ, you die with that same IQ. It's immutable. It just doesn't change. And in connection with that is the third and related corollary premise, which is therefore it is largely, if not almost exclusively, genetic or hereditary. That environment, if you equalize environment, you cannot really equalize IQ. You can't raise someone's IQ just simply by improving their educational opportunities. And so therefore, the fourth premise is that, and this is really kind of the ugliest aspect of it, is that therefore, since IQ is innate and since IQ cannot be fixed, we are, as a nation, looking at what they called a cognitive elite. In other words, the wealthy are wealthier because they are smarter. The poorer are poorer because they are less intelligent, and that this is simply a matter of cognitive ability, that people rise or fall socioeconomically based on their IQ. Now, Gould argued, and many, many others have completely dismantled this as just complete hogwash from top to bottom. IQ is not a number that signifies life outcome. It is possible through equalizing educational opportunity to equalize IQ. I mean, this does occur. That the question of nature-nurture is at worst an open question, and at best, I think there have been demonstrated efforts and situations where it can be equalized. And fourth, the notion of cognitive stratification, that's their term, what it does is it naturalizes a social hierarchy. It simply says that the way things are the way things should be according to nature. So yes, in terms of my title, I changed man to minds because I take on the neuroscience revolution. I mean, neuroscience really takes off in the mid-90s, just when Gould is completing his revised edition. So he doesn't pay attention to those aspects at all. The decade of the brain, as it was known. And so he really, the bulk of his book is about the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and he only added on a long epilogue because he was so appropriately disgusted and outraged with this revival of these pernicious arguments in the mid-90s. So that's the sort of answer to the title question.
And we should say that, and I don't want to jump ahead too much here, but the durability of those ideas and the capacity of those ideas to sort of reemerge as if they are, groundbreaking thinking. You deal with a lot in your book, and frankly, it's a lot about what we talk about on this program, and we deal with a lot of those purveyors of the sort of, I don't know. I feel like it's that theory about if I keep a tie long enough, it'll come back into style on some level. But
yeah.
But before we get there, you start tracking these ideas that what you call zombie science. That which is basically a racialist position, maybe a biological determinist position, a theory about the humanity and particularly in terms of the way our brains and our I guess we function as people. But before you start with the Brown decision, before we get there, give us a sense though, so that we can set this up. Like, what was prior to in the pre-war period, and when we talk about like the early 20th century, theoretically we're coming out of Reconstruction, which I imagine impacted the theories a little bit of this. Just give us if you could, a survey course up into the beginning of your book.
Well, that's a large question, but very briefly, you're absolutely right. This dates back to the 19th century for sure. And what, again, for your listeners who are not necessarily up on their American history, and even the American history books tend to gloss over some of these details. I mean, the Brown decision, the Brown v. Board of Education decision is 1954, and what it did was it overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which the Supreme Court ruled in an 8-1 decision upheld the so-called separate but equal doctrine. In other words, what we could really call apartheid education system and apartheid access to facilities. And they did so on the basis that African Americans were not being denied anything because they had no rights to those things in the first place. It was a kind of perversely circular argument. Because they were black, they did not deserve the rights of whites, but they didn't deserve the rights of whites because they were black. So it made that was the legal pretzel logic of the late 19th century. But mixed into this, of course, as I think you're suggesting, is a kind of proto-eugenic notion about differential racial intelligence between white and non-white, and especially between white and African American, which really sees or really comes into its own in the first decades of the 20th century. So by the early decades of the 20th century, two things converge. First is this seeming sort of meritocracy effort to bring in IQ testing, which is imported from Europe, where, by the way, it had no eugenic background whatsoever. It was simply a diagnostic tool. But when it gets to the States and suddenly meets all these psychologists, the leading psychologists out in Stanford, this guy named Lewis Terman and others, they begin to immediately racialize it. They immediately take IQ testing and they see an opportunity to differentiate between the white superior race and essentially everyone else. So what happens is that, well, two things. I mean, it's a little hard to sort of say this in terms of cause and effect, but there is World War II. And World War II and the rise of Nazism and the collapse of Nazism and the revelation surrounding the effort to destroy European Jewry does cause a bit of a revulsion, just to be a little understated about it, which leads to a new liberal wave in post-war America, which begins to rethink and really unravel some of those eugenicist notions about racial intelligence. Now, in terms of the Brown decision, it both was and was not a major milestone in the sense that it was certainly the major overturning of really a century, if not longer, of a conviction that blacks and whites should live separate lives and should not have access to equal opportunities. It did mandate equality in education, but it did so on psychological evidence. And I think this is the key, and maybe part of the answer to your question, because really the differences between white and black have largely been socioeconomic. They've largely been a caste system based on differential access to opportunities, economic opportunities in not just in schooling, but in employment and so forth. And Brown didn't go anywhere near those questions. It didn't touch the socioeconomic question. It didn't touch the way that whiteness was itself a kind of property, as some theorists have argued, whereby simply being white meant that you could have doors open for you, and simply being black meant that you could not. So putting black and white children in the same classroom was a major advance, an important step, but it based its argument on a flawed, sort of partial way to unravel a century of discrimination, economic discrimination, and so forth. And in its wake, you have this, and again, I'm not blaming Brown or the Brown decision for this. It just did happen, that there was an incredible racist backlash against the Brown decision, lawsuits and other efforts to undo it, to turn it back. And here you see, in the 50s, in the 60s, into the 70s, and a revival of a kind of racial difference in intelligence argument. It really begins to have a rebirth already in the 60s. And you mentioned at the outset that we, of course, are seeing the resurgence of these racist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist notions in our present. But the beginnings of that, really, the beginnings of what we are seeing now, the germs of it, I guess you can say, and that really is the right word, because it is kind of like an infection. They do date back at least to the 1960s, and they were a reaction against Brown. Brown made, one might say, a major stride in the right direction, but it immediately gets assaulted because
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Please.
All right. Well, I want to slow down a little bit and get a little bit earlier.
Sure.
I mean, I think we
did ask for a survey.
The history of the country where there is a significant backlash every time there is a step forward for emancipating black people in particular and people of color broadly speaking. I mean, I think we certainly have talked about this on this program. I often cite Carol Anderson's work in White Rage, which sort of captured that. But in terms of the intellectual history, I'm sort of fascinated. I want to go back to the traveling of the idea of an IQ from Europe to the United States, because it seems to me that what we have at various stages, and this happens following World War II as well, is that these ideas are out there floating around, and the context of the time seeks out something that will fulfill some need that certain ideologies have. Right, so we're in a post-construction, Reconstruction era. We're starting to see the I don't want to say the re-emergence, because I'm not quite clear that it's gone away, but the reassertion of white supremacy in the form of court cases like Plessy v. Ferguson. We're seeing it in the context of subjugating black people's right to vote. We're seeing it in a reemergence of the KKK. By 1920, we're going to have 7% of the population is going to be a card-carrying member of the KKK. And so,
not to mention quota systems on immigration.
Quota systems on immigration. So at this time, there is a need, as opposed to, maybe the antebellum period where it's just like, well, God says we get to have slaves. God has done this. Now there is a need, probably also as a function of the industrial age, to have a rationale for what we used to consider to be God's way. And so this travels over and gets basically caught up in the machinery of intellectualism at that time.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, it's a racist science. I mean, and maybe that's an oxymoron, because science is supposed to be neutral, value neutral, but it really is a racist, perhaps more accurately, a racist pseudoscience, because it is not based in truth. And I think sort of the question you're asking, in the sense you're partially answering, is why does it persist? Why does it? And I think you're absolutely right. It serves a need. It fits a niche. It reaches its audience because it tells people what they want to hear, but it also fulfills, as you say, as religion perhaps falls away as a rationale, something else needs to come in to fill that gap. And quote unquote science is the perfect weapon, as you could, and this is part of a larger eugenicist movement in the 20s and into the 30s, of course, in Europe for sure, but also in the United States. And so these things all sort of converge, and they are, as you say, they are rationalizations. They are ways to make arguments that people can hear and say, oh, that makes sense. And of course, it would make sense to a certain kind of white listener or reader, because, as I said, it tells a person what they are wanting to hear. It has that appeal. And it just kind of, quote, rings true or something, but of course, as I also argue in my book, it's kind of like a tape loop. It also creates a reality. It doesn't just reflect one. It also, Gould is really brilliant on this point in his Mismeasure of Man, because he points out that it's at times of economic stress and downturn that these pernicious ideas tend to gain traction. And I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. But I think in addition to that, and we see this, of course, in our present, where ideas, fallacious ideas, false science, fake news, and so forth, simply get put out there because it's almost like barnacles on the bottom of a boat. They simply begin to kind of cut into the hull. They just erode. They erode trust. They erode a conviction that things can be ameliorated. But if one looks at it from a sort of a broader picture, it's really also about money. It's about funding. It's about policy. It's a way to undercut a belief that public education is worth funding. It's a way to undercut a belief that compensatory efforts are worth funding. It's all of that. It's all of those things and more.
I think it becomes most clear. Excuse me. I think, I just and I want to move on from this and get to some of the sort of those moments where these belief systems become expedient for white people in particular, and particularly how it plays out with attention deficit disorders and whatnot. But
yes.
Before we get there, I just want to stay just for one moment on this point of its use in Europe as an assessment tool, because
yes.
the way that it was used in Europe, it seems to me, is one that recognizes context is crucial, because it's used as a tool to say, as a way of basically correct me if I'm wrong, and please elaborate, but it's basically a way of assessing the who is not getting enough and the proper attention within society, as opposed to a way of saying who is not worthy of the proper attention in society.
That is exactly right. And you correctly mentioned Stephen Jay Gould at the outset, and I'll just mention him one more time, because he says, and I would agree, I have nothing against tools to measure a child's capacity or learning ability. It could be used in all sorts of ways. As you said, it could be used to say, oh, this child is falling behind, say, in reading or math skills, so we need to assist that child a bit more in reading or math skills, rather than, as you say, sort of say, well, let's just relegate that child to the slow track. Let's just relegate that child and pull funding from him or her, because that child is not going to improve. And, you have this right-wing assault on the notion of the plasticity of intelligence, which has been ongoing since the 50s and really dates back even into the pre-war period, but certainly since the 50s, while more liberal and progressive-minded social scientists and psychologists have been arguing consistently, with a lot of evidence, that minds do grow and change, and that, as you said, it's all based on context. I mean, poverty itself, as theorists are saying now, is a kind of environmental toxin. It obviously, I think common sensibly, we would say it impacts the brain in a negative way. So, if one takes context bring it into our discussion, then it changes everything in terms of how we understand how to use the tool of measuring intelligence.
And so we have a situation where you could be, looking at a field and saying, oh, it's dry here. And there's two different reactions. One is, this is a dry field. We should go find one that is wetter. Or you water it and you say it. And it seems that in the way that Europeans used this test was to determine where a field has been insufficiently watered. And the way that when it traveled over to the States was like, oh, this is a way of marking which fields are no good, which ones are fallow forever, and the other ones that are more fertile, essentially.
Right. It sort of comes together with this kind of social Darwinism, or biological determinism, or both. And it is a way to sort of kind of group people and not really believe that they're changeable or helpable or improvable. But that's not the origins of intelligence testing. That's not what it was. It's only what it became when it came to the States at the beginning of the 20th century. And a very deliberate ideological effort, fueled, no doubt, by a white supremacist conviction, whether stated or unstated. It certainly seems in retrospect that's what undergirded these efforts to turn IQ into this measure that somehow differentiated between races in terms of their cognitive ability, which were therefore, immutable, unchangeable, could not be helped ever under any circumstances by anyone, no matter what we tried or did to help them. It's absurd. It's always been absurd, but its impact has been enormous. And the way it's lingered into the 21st century is, I mean, to put it bluntly, just unsettling at least and disgusting, really.
Well,
but as you pointed out, we're seeing a resurgence of this now in our present.
Well, I want to get to there, but before we get to there, let's.
Sure.
I'm fascinated by the history that you did on or recounted on how on the use of Ritalin. And there are basically two different aspects to this. One is how the medical field, and I guess we're talking about the 60s now.
Yes. How
the medical field understood the incidence and the treatment of hyperactivity at the time, and how, in retrospect, with the ability of hindsight and looking at sort of like broader data, it was actually this diagnosis was used in the context of sort of maintaining some type of white supremacy on some level, or at least, if not in an actionable one, at least a diagnosable one, right? Will you explain that dynamic?
Yeah, it's a little complicated, so I'll try to be as clear as I can. I mean, basically, pediatricians have known since the 30s or 40s that giving stimulant medication to young people actually calms them down. It has a counterintuitive effect. But it's only in the late 50s or early 60s that this begins to be experimented with in any sort of systematic way on children who are having difficulty academically in school. And it's only in the, say, mid-60s that this really becomes a fairly clear diagnostic category. A diagnostic category that I should add is invented to fit the condition that is being observed. There's no medical evidence. There's no organic test that reveals anything different about this child, except the child has these kind of vaguely general symptoms, can't sit still or talks out of turn or, sort of fidgets or something. These pretty vague things that could be applied to virtually any child at some point in his or her life. And
behavioral ones, not like
right.
There's no low incidence of white blood cells or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's behavioral. It's completely done through observation, which is why psychologists get involved, because they're the ones who are called in to do the observations, and then the prescriptions are given. But as it happened, and I was sort of, as you said, it's a kind of a fascinating story, is that it's quite overwhelmingly white boys, white children from middle-class backgrounds who are being diagnosed with this new disease category, which was named minimal brain dysfunction, or MBD, which really is coined by a psychologist in the mid-60s. But it's applied almost exclusively to white boys. And why would that be? Because white parents were appalled at the idea, and appropriately so, that their child might be considered either, quote, retarded or somehow slow. And they didn't want their child to be classed as having this other disease category, which involves having a kind of brain, retardation, essentially, what was called retardation in the 60s. Those classifications were given out almost exclusively to black children, or black boys, African-American children. So you have this way in which a disease category is invented seemingly to fit to sort of soothe the anxieties of white parents about their white children, so as not to have them labeled as learning disabled. And in fact, this tendency, even though MBD falls away as a diagnosis, it's replaced by hyperactivity, it's replaced by attention deficit disorder, and ultimately by ADHD, which is now the diagnosis in the 21st century. I mean, a couple of things happen. Ritalin takes off. I mean, millions of prescriptions are written in the courses of the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. The numbers just skyrocket. I think in our present moment, I think it's something like 9%. That might be the number. 9% of all school children get some kind of diagnosis of ADHD. But even into the present, the majority, as in I think 2 out of 3 children who are diagnosed, are white. It remains a white diagnosis. And so what I do in this book, what I do in this chapter, is I try to unravel the racial roots of hyperactivity and of the use of stimulant medication to alleviate an invented disease category that, as I said, is essentially being sort of pulled out of thin air to soothe white parents or white mothers' concerns about their children. So it's a way in which you have these alternative ways to understand intelligence and race, because obviously, since there aren't differences in racial intelligence, there are going to be white children who are going to have difficulty in school. But there has been this concerted effort not to label them as learning disabled in the same way as black kids are being more easily slotted or tracked into slower classrooms in the 1960s and 1970s. As I said, it's a complicated story, but that gives you perhaps a small piece of the puzzle.
The idea is to pathologize this phenomena in white kids because and make it as if it's curable and distinct from their body. It's something from the outside on some level that afflicts them, as opposed to an inherent condition that they are.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct. Yes. Even though, and people psychologists pointed this out at the time, they're saying, we're seeing the exact same symptoms in white children and black children. Why are we treating them differently? Why are we giving compensatory education to black kids but giving meds to white kids? Like, why are we understanding this condition in a racially distinct way? But again, I think the roots of those differences have a lot to do with the power of this false notion that there are racial differences in intelligence, that this carries over into medicine, it carries over into diagnoses, and it carries over into treatment programs.
What I find also sort of fascinating about what you've written about here is how closely it, and I my apologies to you if you are as aware of what is happening on YouTube within the context of this movement and this revival of Charles Murray as I am. But I suspect that you hopefully have been able to avoid falling too deep into that. We spend an inordinate amount of time here on this program dealing with that.
Tell me more.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of the intellectual dark web.
Perhaps. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to.
Well, what I'm referring to is there are a group of supposedly who starting with Sam Harris, who is a self-anointed neuroscientist, also a meditation expert, who brought Charles Murray onto his program recently, a very widely listened to podcast and YouTube show, because in the name of saying stuff that is taboo. And this notion that nobody will give this guy a hearing anymore, and I'm going to do so in the pursuit of intellectual curiosity and whatnot. And there's a whole crew ranging from this guy Jordan Peterson, who is a psychiatrist out of Canada, who is espousing and folks like Dave Rubin, and then other more conservative figures who are basically who argue that they have to hide out in the dark web because their ideas are so radical and so new and so scorned that they don't have access to the regular web. Now, of course, they do. They're all on YouTube. They get enormous amounts of funding and whatnot, and television interviews. And the intellectual dark web was coined by a New York Times article about them that their publicists obviously helped generate. But this idea of what a guy like Corey Robin would call really the definition of the reactionary mind, which is to bring back these ideas, which are extremely old and in fact, not challenging of the way that society has functioned for decades and centuries, in some cases, millennium, and try and sell it as if it's a new idea that is breaking taboos. I mean, talk to that, because that seems to be a big part of this story.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, you really have to stop and wonder how this happens. How does it happen that someone who is speaking about something which is so embedded in the 19th century notion of racial distinctions in intelligence and behavior and so forth can, in the 21st century, act like they're breaking barriers by saying this aloud? I mean, it was nonsense and garbage then. It was white supremacist. It fueled slavery. It fueled Jim Crow. It fueled all kinds of atrocities and inequalities. It was, I mean, pardon me, but it was a kind of social engineering at its most disgusting and worst, because it kept people subjugated and humiliated and debased. And now in the 21st century, you're absolutely right. They act like there's this behavior that, oh, we are speaking the truth. We are finally getting the truth out. We are breaking the taboo on these subjects. But the thing is even that strategy of acting like they're breaking a taboo that, that can't be spoken, they're finally speaking the truth, that is itself just a tired method of acting like they're saying something new when they're saying something, as you said, that has been out there for centuries. And it's appalling. But it's an interesting strategy, because what it does is it reverses the terms, right? It acts as if it's the left or progressives who are somehow squelching debate. They're somehow, we're the ones who are not permitting them to speak. Well, as you pointed out, they're all over YouTube. I don't really see Charles Murray's career as not having had a venue for the last 25 years, if not certainly longer. His books are published. His books are widely read. His books are widely reviewed. He gets onto media. He gets invited to campuses where there are sometimes problems, but he brings those problems with him. So it seems to me that this is just a reversing of the terms of what is real. But we see that a lot, I think. I mean, I think, you're a canny observer of media, perhaps more certainly than I am. But I think you would agree that we see these reversals. They accuse their opponents of doing what they themselves are doing. They act as if they're the ones who are speaking the truth. Finally, we're getting the truth. They're trying to shut us down. But really, that is not the history of the United States. It's been the left that gets blacklisted. It's the left who gets squelched and suppressed. It is not. The right is in power, and it's hard to argue in this day and age that they're an embattled group. As I said at the outset, and I'll say again, I mean, these convictions about racial differences in intelligence are enjoying a resurgence in our present. They are guiding policy. They are not some kind of something that you have to go onto the dark web to find. You just have to, turn on your television or turn on your radio or Google something, and there it is for you in living color.
Let's talk about how it does enter into policy and this concept of the disappearance of the social.
Yes. Well, as I said, psychology enters the conversation really in a big way in 1954 in the Brown decision, which is why I begin with the Brown decision, because it's the Kenneth and Mamie Clark so-called doll experiments where they showed white children and black children dolls which were identical except in skin color, and they asked the children to ascribe characteristics to the white doll and the black doll, and black kids tended to ascribe more positive values to the white doll than the black doll, and therefore the Clarks argued that segregation was hurting the self-esteem and the self-worth of these black kids, these segregated black kids, and therefore schools needed to be integrated. That was the argument that won the day in 1954. But since then, we've seen that now the door had been opened to using psychological evidence to argue about race and intelligence and self-worth. You have a whole slew of psychological terms. For example, the term learned helplessness, which was coined by Martin Seligman, who would later become a sort of the father of positive psychology in the 1990s. But in the 1960s and 70s, he coined the term about learned helplessness. And of all people, it's Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's an assistant and speechwriter for Richard Nixon, sort of stumbles on this term. And suddenly Nixon is giving a major address to Congress in 1969, and he's talking about why compensatory education is not working. And suddenly he's saying it's not working because children are suffering from learned helplessness. And I'm thinking, wow, like that's how the idea migrates from the rarefied world of academia into the mouth of the president of the United States to argue against compensatory education as early as 1969. I mentioned, I believe, earlier about deferred gratification, which is a notion that Walter Mischel came up with his Marshmallow Experiment. And that idea sort of also travels into policy debates. David Brooks of the New York Times wrote a column, I believe it's called Marshmallows in Public Policy or something like that. And he basically argued that, you can't change people by simply throwing money at the problem, because people have these character flaws. And if they have these character flaws, such as they can't resist impulse, you're never going to get anywhere by just sort of improving their economic or social environment. So you have ways in which psychology has sort of found its way into all sorts of policy debates over the last 4 or 5 decades. And it's
we should say that marshmallow experiment also has been since, I think, debunked. Even the premise of it, never mind the how it was weaponized.
Exactly. I mean, it's been debunked because, as you pointed out earlier, context is everything. I mean, as researchers found, if a child has not had opportunities to get food,
right,
to be presented with food, they're like, oh, I'm hungry, I want to eat now. Or if a child is deceived and told they're going to get something, but then it doesn't actually come to them, then they're actually more suspicious and less trusting of the world in which they live.
Right.
Well, this is a socioeconomic reality. It isn't really a, quote, character flaw. But as you pointed out, this is about the disappearance of the social. It's not my term, but I think it's a very appropriate one, the disappearance of the social in social psychology. Because when you begin to psychologize things, you move inside the body, inside the mind, with neuroscience, say, and you leave the world outside. You don't pay as much attention, if at all, to the kind of social or economic and material contexts that I think you would agree have a major impact on what people do or decide not to do in a given situation. So you have psychology making these inroads into policy. And I don't want to completely dump on psychological research. There's been good psychological research, of course, but generally when policymakers have picked up the threads of these experiments, like a Brooks or like a Richard Herrnstein or Charles Murray, it has not been to advance a more progressive-minded argument about the need to equalize opportunities.
And even more, almost even more importantly, or I should say, more to the point, that the psychology has a subjectivity, right? And so it cannot be used in the essentialist way that it's used. I mean, that to me seems to be the most problematic part about it. They may not, because they'll argue, those folks that like, look, I may want to have a more progressive policy, but the facts are just telling me that it doesn't work, right? And it's really that elevation of that psychological theory to an immutable fact, which is the most problematic and the most abused concept.
Well, I think if I'm understanding your question or your comment correctly, I think what psychology appeals to is a desire to believe in something that's trans-historical. In other words, something that is simply, quote, true about human nature. And I think that's the error. I mean, psychologists have done some reflecting on this. There are good psychologists, of course, who reflect on the boundedness, in other words, the limitations of their own research in terms of applying it to understanding policy or politics or social reform and so forth, education and so on. But it is interesting to review this history, as I have done in this book, because you see really odd things emerging. You see liberals using biological arguments to make a case. You see conservatives leaning into environment to make their case. You see a real scrambling and sort of muddying or mixing and matching. And so what you realize is that psychology, in a kind of basic sense, really reflects politics more than almost anything else. I mean, if you want to understand the politics of a certain historical moment, read the psychological data from that moment. It will reveal a lot. And I think that's a lot of what I discovered in doing this project, is that I'm not here to judge the past. I'm here simply to map the changes over time. And what I see is that psychology changes with the times, sometimes perhaps for good, but often it's become, I think it's fair to say, not completely, but largely disconnected from social realities, in the sense that neuroscience, in particular, the social cognitive affective neuroscience revolution, or SCAN as it's sometimes called, has made attempts to understand the world we live in. Certainly, you can read their journals and you see them talking about politics a lot in some cases. But in terms of what is lasting or really vital in terms of their evidence or their conclusions, I would hesitate to lean too much on those conclusions in terms of revealing very much about the material, social, economic realities that we all are grappling with, and inequalities, despite their real enthusiasm that they're onto something by trying to figure out which part of the brain activates in relationship to certain stimuli using MRIs and so forth.
Well, Michael
Staub. fMRIs. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Michael Staub, the book is The Mismeasure of Minds, Debating Race and Intelligence Between Brown and the Bell Curve. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.